Welcome to our BME industry seminar. Thank you for coming. I know it's 5 o'clock and a lot of you would like to be going home. But so this is our second industry seminar, and I'd like to thank Dr. Tommy, who's been really spearheading our efforts to really create the seminar series, and also this is part of our efforts to provide more of an industry and outside perspective to our students and faculty also, and promote interactions with industry, which is really important in engineering obviously, but particularly in biomedical engineering, I think, where a lot of the work that we do is really designed to lead to have an impact on patients in the clinic, so it really involves the translational component. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Buckland, and you'll see that he's really an amazing entrepreneur that had an amazing success in his career. And I've had the pleasure to work with Eric. I was just checking in my computer when is kind of the first documentation I have for that, since 2008, so it's been I think about 10 years. Yep. And it started with the work that we do at Bascom Palmer Eye Institute with Dr. Parel and the clinic. And I think at the time it started with a need for a system to do pediatric imaging, correct? I think
that was what drove the first discussion, right?
So we were looking for OCT technology, imaging technology, to image essentially babies in the clinic. And then we discovered Bioptigen. At the time, I think it was just a few years after Bioptigen was founded. And Eric will tell you more, I guess, about the OCT space and the story behind that. And this really led eventually to SBIT, like small business grants funded by the government. And it was also really beneficial to us in the long term, because then when we had some specific needs for our own research projects, NIH grants, we always knew that we could go to Eric, and he was always excited to work with us to help us implement our ideas, which isn't always the case when you work with companies. So I think we've had a very productive and fruitful relationship with Bioptigen over the years. So I downloaded Eric's CV from LinkedIn, so if you want to know more, you can just go there. It's free, it's available online. But in short, Eric got his master's and PhD from North Carolina State, his PhD in '97. Then he spent several years going up the ranks in industry, in different companies, and I'm sure he's going to talk about that also. And he became the president and CEO of Bioptigen in 2004. And last year left Bioptigen after it was acquired by Leica, a big German company. And now he's the entrepreneur at Pi, his new venture, I guess. So Eric, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Fabrice. Fabrice, thanks very much for inviting me here. The reason that I'm here, as Fabrice said, was because of 10 years of collaborations that I had with the Ophthalmic Biophysics Center and the Bascom Palmer Eye Institute. I'm going to tell you the story. I'm not going to focus on kind of my pre-career before Bioptigen, because all that matters is Bioptigen. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the journey with the focus on my journey to understand my customer. And what I would say is that's the most important part of a startup. And that's the reason we form a company. And it's not obvious when you start a company exactly where you're going to end up. And we've had some conversations today about that in various forums. And so I'm going to talk about some other things that are part of the process, but if there's anything I want you to be thinking about is understanding, how do you understand a market and your customer? Because that's what we're trying to do when we form a company. That we're trying to solve somebody's problem. So as Fabrice said, I've left Bioptigen, which is now Leica Microsystems, and formed a consultancy and an incubator to continue the work in translating your research, perhaps, particularly in the field, but not limited to ophthalmics and vision. I have a short quiz. So I named my company 4Pi Innovations. Does anyone know why 4Pi?
Everything. 4Pi solid angle means everything.
You win. Okay. 4 pi is the solid angle of a sphere, right? So it's 360 degrees in all directions. And that, you have to think that way in a startup company. Okay, I'm going to start with some context. To build a successful startup is really not that hard. There are only 4 steps. Have a customer, a product that has a value proposition for the customer, be able to deliver that product to a customer, and do it with a sustainable advantage. That's all you need to know. So now everybody go out and start your own company. Because then at the end you're celebrating. I forgot that I had this cue card in here. So kind of everybody hears about different, huge successes in the startup space. So in the ophthalmic space where we played, here are a couple. LensX, which is a femtosecond laser company, was acquired for $750 million by Alcon. Optometica, which followed LensX in exactly the same space, the value went down because they weren't first, and they $400 million. A company that's associated with you is InFocus, that was acquired just 2 years ago by Santen for $700 million. These are great, and if we could all do that, why would we do anything else? But here's a different look at the statistics. Only 1 out of 300 SBIR awards lead to commercialization. Does everyone know what an SBIR is? At least SBIRs are grants that the government gives to small businesses to commercialize technology. So 3% of all federal extramural research funding goes to this SBIR program. So it's available to anyone who has a startup. But they're not generally successful. So 1 out of 300 leads to commercialization. Angels are like the Shark Tank people who invest in companies out of their own pocket. Only 1 out of 100 angel investments provides a return to their investor. Venture capitalists, they invest more money. They're, let's say, smarter and more ruthless. But only 1 out of 4 venture capital-backed companies succeed. So we can look at this a little bit differently. I think we've all variously heard that 80% of startups fail, or 90%, or whatever number you've heard. It's not like they fail overnight. You wake up one morning and you're breathing in the morning, in the afternoon you die. Here's some statistics from a great website if you have never looked at it, statisticbrain.com. If you have questions about how the world works, it's really cool. But in different fields, you can see the percent of companies still operating after 4 years is just slightly over 4%. I don't think any of us view that a company that only lasts 4 years is successful. We can look at a different number, the percent of companies that fail over time, and by year 10, 71% in this statistic has failed over time. So the probability of failure is kind of high. So how do we reconcile this? What's the disconnect? Here's my view. First, it's really hard to get close to your customer. So even if you have an idea, that idea you have, and maybe you've shared it with your friends and you've built it out with discussions among your friends, but you are an individual and an anecdote. You need to serve a market. So somehow that you have to find the greatest common denominator problem to solve. And to do that, you really have to understand the problems that your customer has. And that's really not easy. In fact, it's really hard. The second thing as technologists is we get enamored by our technology. So we're doing something cool, and that cool thing everybody should want. And then we start focusing on that. And in fact, as I've said to people today, if you want to talk to me about your startup idea, and if you start talking to me about your technology, we should already go home, because that's not a startup, right? So we have to go back to the top here. And I've seen this in almost every startup I've interacted with. It's a long transition to move from talking about your technology to talking about your customer in the market. Those who are experienced and successful, you'll find it the opposite way around. The other thing is kind of an impedance mismatch between your work as researchers and the work in a company to develop a product. And in its simplest form, I would just point out that research and development, we always say, research and development. No, there's research and there's development. And these are really quite different beasts. And so there's a impedance mismatch between moving from the research concepts in a lab to developing a product. And finally, no matter what I can say to you and how I would answer any particular question you have today, or no matter what book you read, the bottom line is, I think people know how to do this. You can find books. You can sit down and follow a book. But we all have limited resources. So at every minute of every day, you're making a decision on what to put your attention on. And it's that cumulative attention that leads, if you given everything else correct, that's going to lead to your success or failure. So that, in summary, is my experience at Bioptigen. Any questions? Okay, so the last part is, look, we're operating in the real world, and my favorite philosopher once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So no matter, we can talk about this till the cows come home, and the real world, once you step out of this, you're dealing with unknowns that you cannot begin to plan around. And that's frankly part of what makes it fun, but makes it hard. All right, so that's the context. So I'd like to walk you through a bit of the history of Bioptigen with a focus on our product evolution, and towards the end I'll get to kind of some of the let's say the more standard topics like regulatory and finance and things, so you can see what we actually did. So here's our history in a nutshell. So Bioptigen was formed as a spin-out of Duke University in 2004. I had two co-founders. One was Professor Joe Izat at Duke. I literally knocked on Joe's door and said, "You want to start a company out of your OCT technology?" And he looked at me and said, "Have we met before? Who are you?" So it took a while to get to know each other. We did optical coherence tomography, which potentially has lots of applications, but we focused on ophthalmic imaging. I'll tell you a little bit about kind of the transition to move from the concept of this to this. We were funded by 3 different avenues. We were very successful in SBIR grants. We had $9 million in SBIR awards. We had 1 perfect score on a phase 2 SBIR grant. We had 5 phase 2 SBIRs. We commercialized 3 products. Paul Sieving, the director of the NEI, uses a slide about Bioptigen in his talks, or at least he did a couple years ago. We didn't raise any venture capital. All of our funding from individuals came from angel funding through organized angel networks, mostly along the East Coast, and also some wealthy individuals. And then the bulk of our funding actually was strategic funding. And actually our strategic partner was an introduction from Jean-Marie Perel at Bascom Palmer, because he had confidence in what we were doing. Our strategy from the beginning was translation. Go from bench to bedside. Where we are today, if we had known as clearly where we were going, maybe we would have been there faster and bigger. But it took some energy. Here are some slides that I'm going to show you some more pictures, but from mouse imaging to pediatrics. Here's some of your colleagues, and surgical imaging. So there's a great YouTube video on the web by a guy named Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K, that I recommend you read, and I don't know exactly what he calls it, but the question is why? Why are you doing something? And his comment is that all great companies succeed because they can express the reason why, rather than just what they are doing and how they are doing it. And Bioptigen's why was clear from the very beginning. We did this because we believed images mattered. We believed images mattered to researchers. We believed images mattered to clinicians, and our job was to build the best imaging system, and then figure out, this is where the technology push was, figure out how this made a difference in our customers' lives. We started in preclinical and small animal imaging. At the time that we started this, the imaging of small animals was basically toxicology, but there was a convergence of technologies around the time we started the company, and that is knockout mice were invented. The Nobel Prize was awarded to a professor at the University of North Carolina for genetic knockouts of mice, and the industry started creating genetic modifications to mice that were relevant to human eye disease. And so researchers needed an imaging tool, and we happened to be there right at the beginning. So we focused on building the best mouse imaging system in the world. So the company is still selling them, so if you've got a lot of mice you care a lot about and want to buy a Bioptigen in visu system called Leica, you'll need about $100,000 to $120,000. But you can get these great images of the layers of the retina and even these en face images. So we get volume images at this resolution in about 3 seconds. Quite literally, as we started serving the mice, we built a kind of a compact imaging head to image the mice eyes, which are about 3 millimeters in diameter. And in the ophthalmic space, there are a lot of MD PhDs, and so some of the MD side of the PhD said, if you can image mice, can you image kids? So we said, yeah, let's build the first pediatric imaging system. There weren't any. So we listened to our customer and we built the first OCT system for pediatrics. There were two, let's say, key innovations. One was that it was the first handheld probe for ophthalmology, and the second was that it was directed towards pediatrics. And this is Cynthia from Toronto Sick Kids Hospital. But right away, off the, literally one of the first systems, they imaged a child that had retinoblastoma, which is a rare but leading cause of blindness in children. And these were the first images to show where this tumor nucleates inside the retina, and it turns out it matched histochemistry. This set of images actually got published in Cell and had quite an impact. And so now we had our path to the clinic, and as Fabrice said by way of introduction, that started the interaction with Bascom Palmer. But children, we were imaging premature babies to, the first 2 years of life mostly. And a lot of, so babies are not cooperative. So it's one thing to image them by hand, but sometimes that wasn't even enough. So surgeons wanted to take them in the OR and image under anesthesia. So they call that EUAs, or exam under anesthesia. And that introduced us to surgeons. And surgeons said, well, if you can image children in the OR, why can't we image adults in the OR? So that brought us into intrasurgical imaging. So in this case, like here's an example of a retina peel. There's a membrane over the retina, and this is the retina before we peel it. The surgeon can go in and see where it's tied down to the nerves in the retina, peel it off, and see what's left. So this is an example of a system. This is the reason we were acquired in the end, was because we developed a surgically mounted imaging system that a surgical microscope company needed, and that's what led to our acquisition. So Bioptigen had a history of firsts in this progress. So we had the first ultra-high resolution OCT. So when we introduced our resolution, it was the highest resolution on the market. We didn't get the first FDA clearance for tabletop of this generation of OCT, but we did actually have the second. We were the first to have an OCT system that could do both the front and the back of the eye in the same system, the first handheld. We also invented the deepest imaging OCT system that's now used in surgery. 2012, we made an extreme resolution system that could image features that were 1 micron in size. And then our first certification as a medical device company came in 2011. We got Health Canada and Australia registration. And the most important of our registration, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, was for handheld OCT for premature babies. It still is today the only OCT that's explicitly cleared for pediatrics, and it's the only handheld system. Other companies are still trying to develop such systems to compete with Leica now. Go figure why they haven't done it yet. Also, we're a company of 20 to 25 people. We sold into 25 countries. So that was pretty exciting. So as we, in fact, Leica at the end of last year got an order for and delivered 10 systems into Japan. Japan has 3 OCT companies, and it's kind of a closed market. But what we offered was unique. So in 2015, we were acquired. And we were acquired on the basis of a couple things. One is we had already developed a company. So we had a business, we were selling product. At the time that we were sold, this is a little misleading, we had 2 FDA clearances, and we had over 60 patents organically from our engineers in the company. So Leica bought the system, and they announced that they bought the Leica OCT system support, ophthalmologists, etc. They've kept, they moved let's say the business management to Leica Medical in Switzerland, but in Morrisville, North Carolina, the same team, the Bioptigen team, continues to develop and manufacture the systems in North Carolina. So if I can't click this here, but if you want to see how you move from startup to big company, just Google Leica Microsystems OCT or Bioptigen OCT, and you'll come to a web page, and you'll see that we're there. And that, I think that's something really to be proud of. So it's very hard. It's a different business to develop a product and do that early translation, and then scaling a business is quite a different investment. And I think it is a normal path to want to have a bigger company take this and scale this. So Leica is now scaling this globally. Okay, so that's our history in a nutshell. How did we get there? So when we started, this is kind of a slide from my first deck. So I've kind of just taken and pasted the whole slide there. So our first vision was that we were participating in the biomedical imaging market. And the total imaging market was a $16 billion market. Microscopy, optical microscopy, is a $3 billion market. Ultrasound is a $3 billion market. Confocal microscopy, high resolution, was 200 million, et cetera. So we had this view of the market at this time that pharma spends way too much money on R&D, and the pharma R&D is inefficient, as I think everybody still knows. The medical diagnostic equipment market has a nice attractive growth rate. Small animal imaging today is small, but it's projected to have a large growth rate, and OCT could serve that market. So that's how we envisioned our position in the industry when we first started. At some level, all of that is still true, but it doesn't really reflect our customers. So it doesn't tell us why they're going to be using our system. So we said, okay, where can we apply OCT? So we broke this down into an industrial space, ranging or film measurement, which are still valid applications. And this, by the way, is written in 2004. Preclinical research for developmental biology, drug discovery, functional genomics, functional molecular imaging. We actually have patents on functional imaging with OCT that we never were able to materialize. And then clinical, it's kind of funny. I drew a big circle here around internal medicine, cardiology, GI, and all this. Ophthalmology is this one little circle here. So clearly, our understanding of our customer wasn't mature when we started the company. So not only that, but our assessment of how we were going to come to market wasn't mature. So here's our vision and mission statement. I won't read these in detail, but one piece of our vision was that if we interacted with the research market, we would find our path to a broader market. In the end, that was successful. And I've talked to a number of people with entrepreneurial designs here, and I think that path comes up a lot, and I think that's actually quite a valid pathway. So would I do that again? I'd say if I didn't have a clearer vision on what the clinical endpoint is, absolutely. Would I say it's probably a more efficient path if you really know what your market is when you start? Yes. We also kind of envisioned, I came out of telecom, I know devices, I know optics, and I know supply chain, and so I thought my first vision is we were going to build the highest performing subsystems and bring those to companies who wanted to develop the end user systems. So we were going to be the leader in high performance and be an OEM supplier. What I learned was, yes, we can be the leader in high performance. The world wasn't really looking for an OEM supplier. And we determined we were better off as a systems company pretty quickly. Now, here's our first product. An OCT system attached to a Zeiss stereo zoom microscope in a very attractive, we spent a lot of money on design, a very attractive box. But we were getting good images really from the beginning. What's interesting is this is OCT on a microscope. That's where we ended up. So we started with OCT on a microscope. In fact, we didn't find applications that really demanded this. But for interesting reasons, that is, people who tend to use microscopes want the highest resolution, right? So confocal fluorescence imaging, intracellular imaging. OCT is high resolution compared to ultrasound, and it's low resolution compared to that. So it was the wrong approach to our customer. And here are my first, first images. I came out of fiber optic ribbon. Nobody cared. Okay, we ended up in a good spot, but we didn't start off in exactly the cleanest space. So then we worked on obtaining a sharper focus, and we really shifted through interactions with our market to translational ophthalmology. And we peeled apart our market vision in the ophthalmology space. So the refractive market was half the market. Kind of the disease side is the other half of the market. That's still the case today. And in the disease market, retina, glaucoma, and cataract, guess what? That's kind of representative of the world. We weren't that far off. And then we looked at our product opportunities, and the first thing that we looked at was a pachymeter, which just basically a point measure of the thickness of the cornea. We came in and we looked at the value proposition of that, and we could put a device on the market for $15,000. Nobody would buy that. So we never brought that to market, and we were right. So one of the big ophthalmic players did, and it never went anywhere. Hogstrite had a pachymeter, and they didn't bring that to market. Retinal imaging, absolutely. And I'm going to get back to how OCT has dramatically changed retinal imaging. But frankly, I didn't come out of this space, so I had a lot to learn about what the value proposition here was. And then we also anticipated OCT anterior segment imaging, and that's still a viable opportunity. Okay, so now how did we get there? We didn't get there pretty. So here's our first systems that we sold. So this is literally an early 3D printing, more like an SLA, right? Even from a 3D printing perspective, you wouldn't be proud to have this cover. But Alcon, our image quality at the beginning was really far enough ahead of what was available on the market that we could sell everything we made. And Alcon needed a system for their research, and this is early manufacturing. So Liz, by the way, is still there. This was Singbom. Is now he worked at Axon doing swept source after he left Bioptigen. Now he's off doing something else. And so this was one of our early systems, and we sold that probably for $150,000 to Alcon. By the way, to an Alcon location near Orlando that Alcon shut down about a year after we sold them the system. So somehow, I think we ended up hiring the engineer who bought the system, and he gave us the system back. But it was clear that there was still an opening for desktop OCTs of the image quality that we had. So we polished that a little bit, and we developed this system that we eventually got FDA clearance on. But to be quite honest, we did not know how to compete in this market. So Zeiss was a big competitor, and we did not make it. We made a system with image quality that competed, but the workflow and the ergonomics, they just didn't compete. So we sold, a dozen of these systems. They got into a clinical trial called AREDS2, which was a very important clinical trial for macular degeneration. Put in, I can't remember, 4 or 6 sites and managed out of Duke. And it was useful. Those systems stayed in production for this clinical trial for 7 years. But we realized shortly after launching this and spending money on FDA clearance that we were not competitive. So we had to shift gears.
How much money did you spend for the clearance?
Well, I have a little slide. Almost nothing. $15,000. Don't learn the wrong lesson. I will come back to that. We learned the wrong lesson. It was, for some reason, we hit this at a time where it was too easy. So I'm going to leave that and come back to that. So now we've been through a couple of iterations that are, we're selling product. The market wants us there. They're telling us they want us there. They want our image quality there. But we had to figure out how really to serve needs that will allow this to scale. So now we're focusing more sharply, not just in ophthalmology, but in the unmet needs in ophthalmology. And specifically, that brings us to pediatric and surgical ophthalmology. And through the Bascom-Palmer group and others, Duke, Bascom Palmer, and Toronto Sick Kids, they were begging us for a handheld probe for pediatrics. So that's a good place to be. You want customers asking you to do things. So we developed this handheld probe, and we brought this to market. We'll get to kind of a problem with that, but also people, as I said, they said, well, can we use this for other things in the OR? So we started to do experiments in the OR. This is one that was kind of interesting. Anyone know Second Sight and the Argus prosthesis? So we did some early imaging of the placement of the Argus prosthesis is basically an electronic transducer. You have a camera outside the eye. You tickle a transducer that tickles your nerve fiber layers and sends a signal to your brain, and you can see. And this is used in people who have total blindness. So their retinal photoreceptors are not working at all, but their nerves are healthy. And so actually tickling the nerves and creating sight. And that device is interesting in its own right. It's been FDA cleared. The company is scaling that up. And I heard this week on the radio in Miami advertisements for that device. So part of our view was, well, maybe they need our imaging to be a standard for their surgery. So we worked with them and we did some imaging. You can't quite see here, but in a cross-sectional view, here's a retina, and these are kind of diseased retinas, so they're not shaped very well. And this thing here is the prosthesis, and it's sitting over the retina. And so this is, you can imagine, since we're trying to put an electrical signal on the nerve fiber of the retina, you want that thing to be sitting flat. Over here, and you can't quite see it here, but these little black spots are the electronic points of this prosthesis in an en face view determined by the prosthesis. But this is handheld. It's really not comfortable to sit over the patient and do that. So it was interesting and a little early. But people started using this and buying our system for this and other surgical applications. But you can imagine they have to bring someone in and they're leaning over the patient. It's uncomfortable on the back. So then they said, well, can you bring me a mount so that we can mount it to the surgical microscope? So the next thing we did is this simple mount. And now people were able to mount this to a microscope, use the mechanics of the microscope, and image the patients. I think Bioptigen actually got a lot of credit for driving forward intrasurgical imaging with this, and I think it's fair to say that Zeiss accelerated work on an integrated system because of what we're doing. And so Zeiss eventually, shortly after this, introduced a surgical microscope where the OCT was in the path of the oculars. So now people don't have to move the microscope between two devices. Well, we knew that was coming too, so we said we've got to build an integrated device. So now we adjusted our value proposition, our market proposition. We needed to go into ophthalmic surgical imaging. Why? Because what cannot be seen cannot be treated. So Zeiss actually, Leica is using that tagline that was ours, but basically the market is 20 million patients undergo eye surgery every year, $6 billion is spent on surgery, $1 billion is spent on associated imaging equipment. One thing hopefully you see is that our selling proposition is narrowing and getting more focused. Didn't happen overnight for us. The problem we were solving is that ocular tissues are fragile and surgery introduces damage below the surface. Solution, optical coherence tomography, and to reduce medical risk and improve visual outcomes. I won't go through all of this, but different applications. This is opacity after placement of intraocular lens from cataract surgery. Here's a retina that needs a peel, so there's this traction that needs to be peeled off, but what you can see with the OCT that you couldn't see through a microscope is a latent hole. So you can think of pulling tape off of paper, and sometimes you can pull it off cleanly, sometimes you rip a hole in the paper, right? That's the same thing that can happen with a retina. So if they pull that off wrong and they create a hole, they've created a bigger problem. OCT provides them guidance to this. And then cornea transplant procedures are another one, and I won't go into all the details. So now we have a market that we think is going to scale bigger and possibly faster than pediatrics, but also now we know a partner who's going to need our technology for them to compete in the broader surgical business. So now we have we see an endpoint for where Bioptigen needs to be. But still, to get there, we're missing one piece, and that's workflow. So it's one thing to have an imaging system and have experts come up and use the system, but we need doctors to be able to just turn this on and use it. And so we spent a lot of time in the OR with Dr. Sonia Yu here and with physicians in the Cleveland Clinic and in Europe. And this took a long time, and it took post-acquisition time to get the workflow correct. Here's working with my colleagues here, Marco Ruggeri and Sonia, and trying to figure out the workflow in cornea procedures. But we basically understood that what we were doing is developing a surgical plan, kind of assessing surgical progress, assessing outcomes and concluding. So that's the big picture, but we needed to translate that into the user interface and the final product, which we did not do before we were acquired, but now Leica is selling a product that has all of this integrated into their system. Okay, so that's the progress of how we learned our customer and narrowed our focus and tuned our system to meet the market. Regulatory affairs. So there are lots of other things that we have to deal with. So let me divert into regulatory affairs. So many a startup has crashed on the rocks of the regulatory landscape. So you have to be a medical device company. You have to get a CE mark to sell outside of the US. You need one of 3 paths in the US, a 510K if there's a product that is substantially equivalent, a PMA if this is a riskier device or an implant or a drug. And if it's not a completely risky device, but there's no substantially equivalent, then you've got to go through the de novo process, which means the FDA has no idea what you're talking about. So your education process is a lot riskier. Okay, here's my experience in regulatory affairs. First, in 2006, we got our first clearance, which was on that desktop system. Literally from the day we said inside the company, let's go for FDA on this device. to the day we got clearance was 90 days. That includes preparing the application, getting it reviewed, responding to the FDA. That'll never happen again. So the problem is, since I was in telecom, I wasn't in a regulated space like this before, and I saw 90 days, this is no problem. What are people complaining about? We must be smarter than everyone else. So a number of years went by, and I modified that desktop system to that handheld system, and I said, yeah, it's the same technology, I just squished it. And so we brought it to market without going to the FDA. Ooh. So I've had to learn to live with this. FDA slaps Bioptigen with warning over marketing claims. So we got a warning letter in 2011. That was really painful. And so I stopped selling the product, probably cost me over $1 million in sales during the period that I stopped selling the product. Fortunately, the FDA didn't make me recall anything. And our customers were fairly tolerant because they were using it in more researchy ways than general clinic ways. So customers were tolerant and patient with us. And by the way, kind of everyone had this negative feeling about the FDA, so they didn't really blame me. And I would say, and I talked to the group earlier about this, I don't think that's quite fair. This was my bad. So it took us a year, but we recovered with the FDA and we got clearance on the device. And our warning letter is cleared. But I learned an awful lot about that interaction and respect for the objectives of the FDA and for how to interact with the FDA in a more constructive manner. So we got our first clearance in 2006. We recovered from our warning letter with a clearance on pediatrics, and that became this clearance for the Invisa's C2300, which, as I said, still today is the only handheld ophthalmic OCT system in the world, not just cleared by the FDA. It's the only one in the world. And it was the first to be cleared for pediatrics, I think still the only one to have an explicit clearance, although I say that, but I think somebody copied our clearance for a surgical imaging system and they have our same language in there, so it may not be the only pediatric now. But we drove that forward. And we learned how to interact with the FDA, and when we were acquired, we had milestones to hit after we were acquired, and the first one was getting FDA clearance on our surgical system. So we were acquired in June of 2015. By December of 2015, we had our FDA clearance on InFocus, which is our surgical imaging system. This is what it is. So this is a Leica microscope, and this is the scan head. Oops. The scan head of the surgical imaging system that sits mounted to the microscope, so you can look through the oculars directly through the path of the OCT system. And then we made a modification to a different part of the system, and 1 year later in 2016, we got our second clearance on InFocus. So we learned how to work with the FDA, and we got 2 clearances in 2 years. All right. We're running out of time, so I've accomplished most of what I want to talk about, and the key things. I've got more on finance and everything else. So let me stop here and open it up to questions. And if you have questions where I have slides, I'll go to the slides. But I think I got across the key points I want to talk about in terms of driving towards your market, working with your customer to know what they need, and in the case of biomedical engineering, paying attention to the regulatory landscape. So I thank you very much, and I'll open it up to questions. You can see what the slides are. Oh. Okay, that's the slide I'm going to keep this on. Yes?
When Leica tried to acquire you, how did that happen? Did they invite you to lunch and slide you into the paper on the desk? What was that experience to have this big?
Well, you're recording this. I can't tell you the truth.
Fair enough.
I will tell you that it was an intentional process. So what we realized as we were working on the intrasurgical system, and particularly with work we were doing with Bascom Palmer, is that you can't just attach a device to a microscope and have it work. So the microscope is actually, because of illumination and some other things, it's fairly complex. And so if you're going to attach something to the path of the microscope, you have to understand what the microscope is doing. So there were certain problems we were working on with Sonia that we weren't able to solve working with Fabrice and Marco. We tried lots of things. And so what we decided is to really solve this problem, we needed to get vertically integrated.
What's that?
Vertically integrated. That this needed to be integrated with the microscope. So the first thing we did is we got an agreement with Leica to get one of their microscope heads so we could understand it. And they agreed to do that. And we solved the primary problem. I won't say what the primary problem is. We solved the primary problem, but now we had a relationship with Leica. The second thing is that we came to understand that it was because it had to integrate with the workflow of the microscope, it would be very difficult for us to actually grow the market by selling it as an accessory into the OR. So we decided it was time for us to be acquired. So we talked to various parties. We had private rooms and conferences and showed our system. And at one point in the conversation, the key individual from Leica said, okay, we believe in your technology and what you're doing. We'd like a partnership with a path to control. And then I said, there's only one path to control. And that's how it went.
So what kind of advice would you give for our students, the ones that graduate that want to get into an entrepreneurial company and have the ability to make a lot of money and sharing that from the ground floor? How do they pick where to go and who's going to be one of those 1 in 100 that will be successful?
I'm going to use that as an entree to this phrase. Do this if you can't imagine doing anything else. So it is fun and exciting, and it's also the chance of success is really low. So I'm going to go back to this slide then. So these two things, know the CEO and know yourself. So you have to do some research and make sure you can buy into the proposition of the firm. First of all, that you know the why. You know why they're doing it, and it evokes passion in you. And Google, right? The internet provides you access to information that is beyond your wildest dreams. Do research. Make sure you believe in their competitive position, just from what you can tell. Then, when you're interviewing, look for red flags. I really firmly believe that this is a case where leadership in the company matters, and if you feel like you're being smoke blown up your skirt, and you don't believe in it, don't go unless you've got a high tolerance to unemployment. So what I didn't say here is I did have a startup experience before I started Bioptigen, and I was with a company that failed within 6 months of me joining. So I've seen kind of the bad behavior, and there were yellow flags that I could have paid attention to, but I felt like there was nothing else I wanted to do at that time. And when you're interviewing with the team, if any member of the team kind of complains about the CEO or other members of the team, just go somewhere else, because there's enough that you have to deal with. I think, I've talked to other entrepreneurs who have had kind of bigger exits, some of the first ones that I've shown, and none of them are easy. None of them are easy. So some entrepreneurs I know say, if they don't think that they can have an outcome that amounts to $1 million a year of their time, they don't want to do it. And I'm not so sure that I think that has to be the criteria. But I do think you need to have a market. If there's not a market, don't do it. And so, if the company says, we can grow to $3 million and, that's the size of our market, that's a lifestyle. You may want to do it, but you're not going to do it because it's an entrepreneurial opportunity.
You can't make a market?
I don't think you can you don't want to make a market. I think, we made markets, but making a market is a really long proposition. So, there are, some people make markets, but mostly, the successful, I think the vast majority of the successful startups understand the patterns in the market that they're dealing with. And they come out with a higher value proposition product in a market that already exists. It may be new technology in that market. Like all these, if I go back up to the first slide, I don't know how to get there rapidly. Do you know how to get there rapidly?
Yeah.
That 2 slides down. That one. Okay. These two come. Let me tell you what kind of where they were, because these are big exits. These two companies are in the cataract market, and the cataract market. There's a cataract market and the LASIK market. So in the LASIK market, which developed over about 30 years, there was a transition between a point where you kind of cut off the top of the cornea with a blade, and then you ablate tissue, and then you put the cornea back. And at one company that's not on this list decided we can, instead of using a blade to cut off the cornea, let's take a femtosecond laser and do a femtosecond laser cut, because we think we can get a smoother cut and it'll be better. Okay, so they came into the LASIK market with a new technology, but the LASIK market was clear and they had a different value proposition. They did very successful. They were very successful, and they're now Abbott Medical Optics, bought by J&J recently. So it's had a long history of a lot of success before this. Well, founders of that technology that said, well, what if we take the femtosecond laser and take it to a problem in cataracts? So in cataracts, the expertise of Fabrice, the nucleus of the lens sits in a capsular bag underneath your pupil. And the first thing the cataract surgeon does is peel off an opening on the top of the capsular bag, and then using technology also really developed here, they jackhammer the lens and then vacuum out the lens. So Lensac just said, I'm going to use the same value proposition that we did in LASIK, and that is, instead of manually cutting the capsular bag, I'm going to bring the femtosecond laser in and use a femtosecond laser to cut the capsular bag. So it's a new technology, but that market already existed. So when they did that, their argument is this will make for more stable bags to hold the intraocular lens. And they developed that system and they got bought big. And Optometrica did exactly the same thing. So those markets already existed. All they did was introduce a technology with a new value proposition. In focus, it was a long run for InFocus, but for a very, very big win. And also that this is a glaucoma drainage device. And glaucoma drainage is already a well-known market. And so Len Pinchuk had two things. He had a material system that he already understood from other things that he had done. So he didn't invent a new material system. And in fact, his comment to me just this week was, don't invent a new material system, figure out an application for the material system, because if you have too many risk points, you can't do it. And that's why I say don't invent a new market. If you got a new technology, you can't do a new technology in a new market at the same time. And so they brought a new material into an existing product and demonstrated that this material was more stable. In some sense, I could say that's all they did, but that's what they did. So I think it's very hard. In fact, there's like a 4-box view of the world that people will look at, which is, whether you have a new or existing market and new or existing technology. And if you're trying to bring new technology into a new market, which is the upper right-hand quadrant of that, that's the hardest thing in the world to do. So that's my answer.
So I'll make a comment on the value proposition. It's never quite what you think it is.
That's
so
right.
The thing with the femtosecond laser is it's $400,000 to $500,000 laser. Just chop the lens. So when I do it, I just use 2 instruments. I chop it. It takes me 1 second to do. It costs nothing. So the FDA, the Medicare will not pay for this procedure. So when you're paid for your cataract surgery, you're paid a fixed sum by Medicare or by your insurance company. So if I have a $500,000 laser doing that initial cut, that comes out of my pocket. The Medicare doesn't care how I did it, right? So I would argue there's no value proposition, but what happened was they generated a market where people said, you are good. So the standard way, and even with this pre-chop, you still do all the cataract surgery by ultrasound. All the cataract surgery today is done by ultrasound. It's just the pre-chop is done by the laser. So you get all these patients coming to say, I want the laser for my cataract surgery, and it feels like you're giving less than that if they're not getting a laser, because ultrasound's old day technology. And now they pay $2,500 out of pocket to have that set laser go boom for 1 millisecond, and then get their cataract surgery done, pay $5,000 out of pocket, cash pay, no insurance companies to deal with, and all of a sudden it becomes a worthwhile $400,000 laser for practice to buy.
And the only twist I would say to what you're doing is they didn't develop a new market, they developed good marketing. And that's a little bit, and marketing is very, there are technical integrity doesn't always win, right? And so I agree with everything you said, and I'm very skeptical about these things, but they made some people a lot of money, and you kind of have to decide.
People keep buying into it.
Yeah.
Your grandmother and your mother is going to say, I'm getting the laser done.
Right. So the marketing is a viable approach, and in fact, I'd say a necessary approach. And sometimes your integrity may be challenged, and you've got to decide how much you're going to allow your integrity to be challenged. I'm sorry, Alcon, I'm not saying anything about your product.
We have a question behind you.
Yes, okay. I wanted to ask you specifically about the process of getting a technology that is being developed in a university lab, and what the relationship is with the university when you want to take that to market.
That's what I, let's say, want to continue to stay involved in, because I think it's not a stable process, and different universities, it's been evolving over time, and different universities behave somewhat differently. But there is at one level, the process is simple. You form a company outside of the university, you go to the licensing office, and you ask to license a patent, because that's all the university has really to give, is they want to license patents. And generally, the terms for that patent will be a combination of some equity in your company, and you owe them some royalties, and maybe there's a back-end fee on exit, a success fee. And then your company is separate from the university, and you build a company separate from the university. That's in a simple shell. That's how it works. It's never that simple. So why isn't it that simple? One is, usually what you need in the company is more than the patent. You need know-how. So most patents are not valuable. And I've looked at the statistics of patents. So the average, this is a little bit dated, but I think that the thought is still true. The average cost of getting a patent and maintaining a patent over its life is about $25,000. The average value of a patent is $6,000. Okay? So do you have the winner? And since you tend to submit patents at a stage where you want to protect an early idea, that patent may not reflect what you actually need. And my experience with the universities that I licensed from, so I've now licensed from 4 universities, is that universities will not license forward IP. So if you get patent A today and the professor inside the university, it doesn't really matter whether the professor is contributing to the company or not, does an improvement, patent B, you've got to go back to the university and negotiate that. So now there's a certain goodwill. So in my case, I was able to bring in a lot of IP from Duke that followed our first license until a different inventor was on the patent, right? When a different inventor got on the patent, then Duke needed to get approval from that other inventor. And I actually had an episode where I had the option rights on a patent from tech transfer, and the inventor said, no, I want it to go somewhere else because I think there's a bigger payout somewhere else. And I already had the option. But I wanted to maintain goodwill, so I sold the option back. And I won't go into the details, but I sold the option back. I said, okay, you can have it. So there are icebergs out in the ocean that you have to navigate. What I see is that universities across the country are evolving how they think about this. So when I started Bioptigen, the universities saw tech transfer as a profit center. By law, by this thing called Bayh-Dole Act, which is fun to read, by the way, and I've read it, but the Bayh-Dole Act says that universities have a mandate to commercialize their technology, and that in that mandate, they may get patents and they may license patents. And tech transfer offices, when we started Bioptigen, they were kind of saying, we must make a profit on patents. That's not what Bayh-Dole Act says. So Yale University now publishes kind of their express license, and at different universities that I talk to, people are picking up on that. So much, let's say, less taxing terms. And if I had had those licenses when I started, I would have saved tons of money and tons of time and stress, because it's actually a pretty good license agreement. The royalty rate at 2% is reasonable. The equity ranges from 1% to 3%, which is perfectly reasonable. A little bit of success fee, maybe 1%. That's fine. And then you know that makes it a lot easier. It doesn't cover the forward IP piece, but it's more supportive of the process to spin out technology.
Talking about like how you build the value and how you identify whether your product or your research product is actually valuable. So in your case, you have the pediatric surgeon that told you, we have this need. So that was kind of an easy. But normally, like how do you kind of retarget your product? Like you do research, but there is so much, I mean, if you go on Google, there is so much. So how do you identify your market and whether it's going to be a really useful product or...
Well, so as Richard pointed out, sometimes useful product it doesn't need to be the case, but let's talk about those. What they were able to say, they were able to count procedures. So they were able to say, if this works, let's start with that. If this works and if this creates value, there's a lot of money that's going to be spent. So they were able to very easily compute the size of the market. And that's really kind of the first part. So I would say, I would focus on making sure you have a market first, because it's easy to find, one user for any idea you have, right? So.
But what if the surgeon you do your analysis and say, okay, this is going to be more advantageous. So then you go to the surgeon, and the surgeon is like, oh no, I don't care because I'm happy with what I have.
Well, first of all, you cannot go to one person. You have to survey a lot of people. And now in the SBIR program, now they have the ICOR process, right? And they force people to go and do 100 interviews, which I think is incredibly exhausting, but I think it shows the point. You cannot talk to one person. The other thing, and this is kind of the Steve Jobs approach. Steve Jobs always said, the customer doesn't know what the customer wants. Well, Steve Jobs is an unusually brilliant, person in terms of understanding and selling a vision for what customers might want. And I think you can do that. So but you still have to provide you have to have lead collaborators. That's what I would. If you don't have people who believe in what you're saying, it's fine. You could spend your whole career fighting that, and sometimes there are brilliant people who don't get recognized for their brilliant ideas until, long after they die. That's not a good way to be an entrepreneur. Okay, so you won't make much money. But what I would say is you've got to find people who believe. You also have to find skeptics and figure out what they're skeptical about. And some skeptics, some people care, and that's one reason I'm staying in ophthalmology. I think a lot of people care about innovations that improve the life for their patients. So if they have a kernel of belief in you and are willing to provide feedback, then learn from it. If you find that nobody is saying yes, then you have to be honest to yourself as well.
Carlos?
Like from the looks of it, you're the one that brought like all the entrepreneurial experience and management to this company, and your co-founder kind of brought the technology. I want to see if you could just kind of elaborate on the whole process of your co-founder. Like, more often than not, like engineers, we're not going to have people just knocking on our door trying to be like, oh, can we use your ideas and bring them to market? Like, how can we find people like you to help us make a successful company?
It's a good question. One is, you've got a job to do, which is learn to talk about the impact you're trying to make, and that's like the SBIR program. Grants are scored on impact. So, and it's the right thing to do. So you need to think about the impact and believe that you're going to make an impact. And to this slide, don't get enamored by your technology. You want to believe your technology is solving a problem, but the problem has to have priority over the technology. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are lots of kind of entrepreneurial resources around, and I don't know so much in this region, but go to the places, to the incubators, talk to the people who are running the incubators, and talk about your ideas and get feedback. So in North Carolina, the universities are kind of setting up incubators, and people like me, it's not just me, are going around and trying to figure out how they can help, how they can mentor. And that's how you get connected. You got to get your butt out of the chair of the university and go out into the community and find where this activity is happening. And then there are also in communities, as you start to develop, there are kind of pitch competitions. And it's almost like, how you hear about comedians, stand-up comics, they have to take a lot of booze. So you got to get bruised a little bit because you don't know. I didn't know. It's a process, but I'd say develop the why, develop the understanding of the market, and be able to talk from that perspective, which is difficult. But put energy into doing that, and then get out and find out where the incubators are in the entrepreneurial communities. And also, you do have a tech transfer office. I understand that not a lot of staff, not a lot of resources to do things, but part of it is perseverance, right? So if you're the sort of person who goes in and takes no for an answer the first time, they're absolutely right not to bother following up, right? So entrepreneurialism is about not taking no for an answer. So you get up and just go. And at some point, you've got to be willing to kill your baby seal, as somebody used to say to me.
What?
Kill your baby seal.
Baby seal.
Babies, yeah. Now I'm on record, and so when it goes on YouTube, I'm never going to get. You have to be able to say it's not a good idea and refresh it or find something else.
How can we help with these kind of seminars, this format? Because I'm sure that there are other students that have similar questions, so that's why we developed the roundtable discussion and the seminar. Is there anything that you advise us to do during these sessions to help?
Well, I would say so far the discussions have been on point. I didn't get. I'm going to here are some resources. So these are some modern recent books on the process that are actually pretty good. So the Startup Evolution Curve is actually written from someone in Poland. It's a European perspective, but it's almost a Bible. I would recommend anyone interested have this on their desk. Startup J-Curve is good. And Research to Revenue is written by the guy who runs the UNC Kickstarter program, a guy named Don Rose. And it's written for academicians to understand the process. So do that. You know, it's like anything else. You got to do your homework. Nothing's going to completely come to you. The questions that people have asked me today, I think, are right on spot. And the problem is these are 1-hour conversations, and then they terminate. And I don't have a great answer beyond that, other than perseverance. And so you've got my email address, and persevere with me as a point. But Eric at 4pi.com. I view the early stage startup experience as very much like following a process of the scientific method. And I would say every time you think about what you're doing, think in terms of a hypothesis. You're hypothesizing the market size. You're hypothesizing the value proposition. You're hypothesizing what your technology attributes are going to be. And constantly test those hypotheses and keep a record, right? So that you narrow and narrow and narrow, and try to do faster what I did to learn our market. And don't be afraid to ask people you run into for another conversation. So my experience is that entrepreneurs who have done this are more than happy to help the next. And that's why I'm here. And I'm not alone in this.
Yeah, so I mean, my comment to that is that, you know, Eric's never going to come to you because he doesn't know who you are. So at some point you have to start something yourself or approach somebody. I mean, like Eric and John Marie got together at a meeting somewhere, and that's how this all linked up. I mean, I have there's a former biomedical engineering undergraduate here. He's in the medical school. We did some vision screenings. He had this great idea. Ideas are cheap. He comes back to me a little while later. He's got a device. And we're like, this is crazy. This is amazing. So we look into it. We put an IRB, do some testing at the medical school, and now somebody's actually putting in the money to put it through for a patent. So I had no idea who this student was. Wouldn't have known him from Harry, but he came with an idea. I have another biomedical engineering student right now, came up with an idea about some things. And I said, well, that's not really workable, but how about this other thing? Because he turned out, when he was describing what he could do, he had 3D printing technology or background in some of this other stuff. And there's something else I have that would really benefit from a 3D construction to create a new device. So that's something else we're doing. And then we have some other students that, you know, the Bioptigen software, he didn't show the software for how they calculate values, but I didn't actually, the reason we got together was I was kind of unhappy with the device in terms of the information that came back. So I have undergraduate students at UM who are paid, you know, paying by the hour, and they manually segment hundreds of one of those little images to measure thicknesses. And I get data back from one mouse like 2 weeks later because it's like, you know, I don't know, 40 man-hours per eye. Some ridiculous amount of time that's slowing down my research. So we just met just 2 days ago. I found one of the engineering professors here, and now that undergraduate student is meeting with one of the engineers here to do deep learning to see how we can segment this in an automated manner better than my student can. And actually the first iteration that they just showed me Monday was just as good as a student. So, you know, you have to, I mean, you know, Fabrice is not going to come to you and say, what can I do for you today? You have to go up to Fabrice and say, Fabrice, I need some help, and this is what I have to offer. I think it's probably the first step.
Yes, also, you may not be aware, but the Dean has, you know, recently we have an entrepreneur in residence also, Bob Williamson, don't know, some of you may have met him already, that the dean really, I wouldn't say hired, but he's part of the university, and he spends some of his time at the College of Engineering to help students with this kind of, that's one of the things that the dean wants him to do, to help students develop their ideas, and if they have ideas, go and approach him. So, anybody needs his contact information, you just come and see him.
I can't resist mentioning that what happened to me. I had 2 patents that I paid for by myself because the university shot down both ideas. After the first patent was shot down, I should say my application at the tech transfer office, they said it'll never work. I got the patent, paid for it myself, and then they hired my lawyer. So the second patent that came along, and I called up the company and they said, we can't work for you. University of Miami hired us. I said, what the hell are you talking about? You owe me a lawyer. So I got a lawyer in 4 months, and they got a second patent, which the university had shot down. So you can't trust the tech transfer office. They may not know what the hell they're talking about. Don't be too discouraged, but sometimes you're so far ahead that you won't get it. Everybody they call them doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. Okay? They don't know shit, really. Scratch that.
Any other questions? Okay, let's thank Dr. Buckland.
Thank you.